couple of weeks ago, Encounter turned 3 years old. We launched a church on September 10th of 2017. However, we actually moved into the city, Megan and I, a couple of years before that. I was on staff at Church in Annapolis, and Megan was a school teacher. And, when we feel God was calling us to do this, we wanted to move to the city as soon as possible to just get to know the city and how it worked and everything else. So we moved a couple of years before the launch of the church, and we were living in this kind of like big condo apartment in Annapolis. It had 2 bedrooms. It had, nice big kitchen. It was spacious, and we had tons of stuff for it, right? And when we moved to the city, we realized that apartments were much more expensive, and all we could afford was like a small 1-bedroom apartment that was like in the basement of somebody's house. You could only access it kind of like through an alley, and it was really, really cramped. And I think that we knew that, but we didn't really fully realize how small space it was until we moved and we put all our stuff, or tried to put all of our stuff into this new apartment. And I remember because I couldn't help during the move because of my work. I had ended my work at this church, and I was working at a bank, and I could not take Saturdays off. So like the first wave of the move, I wasn't able to help. And I show up to the house once like the first wave of the move has happened, and I get out of work. And all I see is like boxes all over the apartment. All there is boxes. You cannot find anything. You cannot touch anything. It's all boxes. And my day off was on Monday, and Megan had to work. So Megan goes off to work, and I'm left on Monday trying to figure out how to unpack these boxes. And I remember having this moment of kind of like panic, because I'm looking around the apartment. I'm like, I don't even know where to start. Everything is going boxes. I don't know where anything is. I don't know where to unpack first. And basically, I remember I spent the whole day like going through the box, trying to figure out where everything was. And I think I unpacked 1 box because that's all I could figure out what to do. And I'm telling you this story because doesn't starting something or rebuilding something a lot of times feel like that. Like we don't know where to start. Like we're looking around and everything needs to get done. And it feels like nothing can get done without the other thing getting done. And at times it can be paralyzing. It can be this moment that we're like, we really don't know what to do. And we're in the middle of this series called Rebuilding. That's about the story of how the people of Israel rebuild the walls of Jerusalem after the exile that we find in the book of Nehemiah. And the story that we're going to look at today is actually that. How do you start? When you look around and you see that there's so much that needs to be done, and it almost feels like impossible to even, think of how to begin. How do you start? What does it take to rebuild? So, with that, if you have a Bible, I invite you to go to the book of Nehemiah chapter 2. And I'm going to start reading on verse 11. And you can follow along on the screen if you want. This is what it says. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night, I went through the valley gate toward the Jackal Well and the Dung Gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved toward the Fountain Gate and the King's Pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we're in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come. Let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you're doing? They asked. Are you rebelling against the king? I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. Nehemiah has left the capital of the empire, and he shows up to Jerusalem ready to rebuild. And he starts looking around and he kind of like assesses the damage and the work that needs to be done. And then he brings all of the leaders of the city and the region together and kind of like casts him this vision. And the reason why he's doing that is because I think Nehemiah understands kind of like one of the key principles of rebuilding, and it's this: rebuilding takes unity. The work that God has called Nehemiah to do is not a work that Nehemiah can do on his own. It's also not a work for the sake of Nehemiah himself. It's a work for the sake of the city. So what he does is brings the whole city together and listen, this is where we are. Like the walls are in ruin. We are exposed to enemies and we're exposed to robbers and the people are suffering because of this. And we need to rebuild these walls. And you can see kind of like there's this buy-in from the community and they all agree and say, you know what, you're right. We have to rebuild. We have to be unified. And it's interesting because you see that there's all these people on the same page. And then towards the end of like that verse, we see how there's other group of people that, he talks about Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite and Geshem the Arab. And they're hearing about that and they're making fun of them and ridiculing them and saying like, what are you doing? And what you see here is that then Nehemiah kind of like chastises them and saying, we're going to rebuild this wall because this is what God is calling us to do and you have no part in it. And there's a lot of like, writing about why he does that. There's kind of like a lot of ethnic conflict going on in there. He mentions that. But I think there's something else going on. And it's that Nehemiah realizes that if that work is going to be accomplished, it requires unity. Everybody has to be on the same page and pulling on the same direction for things to work. And I think that's true of all levels of what rebuilding looks like. As a church, as we look at the next few months of work that we have ahead of us, we're thinking about rebuilding in a way kind of like our church rhythms and church life. We want to rebuild our volunteer teams and everything else. All of that is going to require first and foremost unity. That we are all on the same page. That we're all buying in that this is what God has for us. That this is the thing that God is calling us to do. The reason why last week I invited you all to pray with me, to seek God, is precisely because I don't want this to be just the vision of Joel. This is a vision that God has for Encounter. And if you're a part of Encounter, you're a part of that vision. And God is inviting all of us to come together in unity and to move in the direction that He's leading us into. But and honestly, this is true of personal lives as well. Like you're looking maybe at rebuilding elements of your family life, or your career, or your future goals and all this. And maybe you've been pulling one direction and your spouse is pulling another direction and your children are like not pulling at all. They're just like sitting around. And maybe for you as a family or for you, with friends or co-workers or partners, whatever it is that you're trying to rebuild, it takes everybody coming together in unity and pulling in the same direction. Rebuilding takes unity. The next thing we see in that verse is that rebuilding takes starting. Okay? This is what I mean. Verse 18. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. It might sound self-explanatory, but it's important to note. Rebuilding takes starting. Well, one of the main problems about rebuilding anything is actually getting started. Because, what can happen is what happened to me when we moved to DC, right? I'm looking around and there's so much to do and it feels so overwhelming and I don't even know where to start and it's kind of like paralyzing. And Nehemiah and the people of Israel could have looked around the ruins of the city and just say, you know what, this is too much. Where do we even begin? Like what section of the wall? What are we going to do? But what happens is that when they come together in unity, there's this agreement and they are able to push forward. And they just said, you know what, let's us start rebuilding. And they began that good work. Talking about rebuilding, dreaming about rebuilding, having meetings about rebuilding, writing Facebook posts about rebuilding. None of those things are actually rebuilding. We need to take steps. And Jesus talks about this, by the way. There's this parable that Jesus tells in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 21, that when I read to you, is what he says, verse 28. What do you think? There was a man who had 2 sons. He went to the first and said, "Son, go and work today in the vineyard." "I will not," he answered. But later he changed his mind and went. Then the father went to the other son and said the same thing. He answered, "I will, sir." But he did not go. Which of the two did what his father wanted? "The first," they answered. Jesus said to them, "Truly I tell you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are entering the kingdom of God ahead of you. For John came to you to show you the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors and the prostitutes did. And even after you saw this, you did not repent and believe him." What is Jesus saying? Jesus is making this interesting connection that the evidence of belief is action. They're saying the people that really believe in God, the people that really repent and believe, which is kind of like what he's applying, he says, is the people that do what God tells them to do. It is not the son that says, "I agree with what you're saying." It's the son that actually gets up and does the work. It's the same principle. Who rebuilds? Whoever gets started and actually does it. As a church, we cannot just start talking about rebuilding forever. We actually have to do things. I remember the first couple of months of COVID, it was really hard to even make decisions about the future because of all the uncertainty. And we're like, okay, we're doing things online, and it was a lot of I don't knows. I don't know when we're going to start meeting in the building, and then it was like, I don't know if we can fit enough people in the building. It was a lot of I don't knows. And at some point, a couple months ago, we just sat down and was like, okay, we just have to figure something out and make decisions and make hard decisions. And it was, okay, we're going to continue doing online, and let's start having monthly worship gatherings, and let's start having our life groups in person. Why? Because rebuilding takes starting. And the work that God is calling us to do, the steps that God is calling us to take, we just have to get up and do them. And I think that the same thing is true in your life and in my life. That maybe God is calling you to do something, and there's this dream in your heart, and there's this vision for what you know God wants you to do, for the thing that God wants you to rebuild or to build for the first time. And you talk about it, and you dream about it, and you write about it, you tell people about it. The one thing you haven't done is actually taken a step to do it. And if you want to see that come into fruition, you're going to have to start. Rebuilding takes starting. Let's look at chapter 3. So Nehemiah chapter 3, the next chapter, verse 1. Eliashib the high priest and his fellow priests went to work and rebuilt the sheep gate. They dedicated it and set its doors in place, building as far as the Tower of the 100, which they dedicated, and as far as the Tower of Hananel. The men of Jericho built the adjoining section, and Zakur, son of Imri, built next to them. The rest of this chapter is more of the same. It's verse after verse of, this group of people build this section of the wall, and then next to them, this group of people build this section of the wall, and then you move a little bit further ahead, and this group of people build this section of the wall. It just goes verse after verse for 32 verses, the same thing. And we look at a chapter like this, and what is there to learn there? And I think there's a couple of things. The first one is that, rebuilding takes others. When Nehemiah casts his vision and tries to build a coalition, he's not only doing it just to create unity for the sake of unity. He's doing it because he knows that this work that God has called him to do is something that he cannot do by himself. God gives Nehemiah a vision that goes beyond himself. It also goes beyond his own benefit. It's for the benefit of the city. And the whole city is invited to come together and be a part of the work. And I almost wonder if there's a sense of pride, all of these different families. That my name is in there. Our family's name is in there. We were part of this rebuilding work. I think this is true about church life. There's this phenomenon in American churches that, there's a few group of people that are the ones doing the majority of the work. And I've been a pastor for a few years. I've seen that, right? There's a group of people that you can always count on things, that are signing up to volunteer and doing different things. And then there's some people that just want to come to church, right? And listen, we love them. And that's you. We love you. And we're really glad that you're tuning in. And we're really glad that you are a part of the Encounter family. But what I say to you is, in the months ahead, as we really start rebuilding, the life of our church and our volunteer teams and our strategy to how we're serving the city and creating community, that's going to take all of us. And that's what it should look like. Like we have an opportunity to hit the reset button and do things in a different way that really bring everybody together. And where everybody's gifts are valued and counted and used. God has given you gifts and talent that He wants you to use in the life of the church that He's only given to you. Because you have a role to play. The invitation of God is for all of us to come together. Rebuilding takes others. One interesting thing in that passage is that Nehemiah's name is not mentioned at all on chapter 3. It's the other families, it's the other people. And I think that's something in there, right? That this wasn't about Nehemiah. This wasn't just a vision about Nehemiah building his own kingdom or empire. It was the people of Israel rebuilding the walls of the city. And I think that's throughout church. Like, I don't want this to be the Joel show, right? Because I'm the one that's on camera talking. This is our church, of all of us. And God is inviting all of us to play a role and play our part. But I also think that this should apply to our own personal lives, right? Maybe we're thinking about rebuilding our family rhythms. Or maybe like our career has changed and we're thinking about rebuilding our work life and our career. Maybe we've moved to a different neighborhood and we're thinking about rebuilding like our neighborhood life and all that. And there's a way in which all of these rebuilding projects can become very individualistic and very self-centered. And they can become about us, about how to benefit us, about how to us we can get ahead. And I think that maybe something here is that the things that are worth rebuilding are things that go beyond ourselves, are things that expand beyond just our self-benefit. That maybe God is calling you to do something different with your work and with your family and with the house that you have that invites other people in, that includes other people, that serves others. Maybe God wants to give you a vision to rebuild that goes beyond yourself, that's going to require the help of others. Anything worth rebuilding is going to take others. The next thing is this. Rebuilding takes work. You know what a common themes on the passage that we just read is there's a couple words that are going to show up over and over again. Like if you go back to the last part of chapter 2, there is a word, right? Like, on verse 16 to the verse end, he says, any others who would be doing the work. On verse 17, at the end, it says, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. The beginning of chapter 3 says, Eliashib, the high priest, and his fellow priests went to work. And the rest of the passage is really describing what? It's describing work. What's a common theme? Well, it's people doing work. Rebuilding takes work. I heard a pastor from New York, John Tyson, preach on this passage Nehemiah a couple of years ago. And he has this line that I always like. He says, God will rarely do for you what He wants to do through you. We have sometimes this misconception of the relationship between grace and the work and effort that we do. So we say, well, because we're saved by grace and, righteousness doesn't require works, we think that almost means inaction. And it's actually the opposite. It's actually like that what we see, that the way in which God moves in the world is most of the time through people. And maybe, we're thinking about rebuilding our lives and we have to understand this connection that it's God the one who gives us a vision for rebuilding. And God the one that gives us a favor. And it's also God the one that through our work accomplishes more than we could accomplish if we were doing that by ourselves. But in the midst of that, what's key? That we have to do the work. That we have to take the steps. That we have to be obedient. That we have to do. Rebuilding is hard. And that's why it requires everybody working together. And as a church, we need to be prepared for that. The next few months are going to be hard work. We're trying to find places to meet and things to set up. And, we're trying to find ways to serve. Like all of this, it's going to be work. But it's going to be work, that's worth it. And it's also going to be work that if we are doing it aligned with the vision that God has for us, work that God is going to bless. And that's going to have an impact beyond what we can do. I mean, it's a challenge for your own life, right? And you have to just prepare yourself and be ready for that. That rebuilding is going to take work. Rebuilding a marriage is not easy. It takes work. Rebuilding relationship with family and friends, it takes work. Rebuilding a career, starting a new career, those things take work. And a lot of times we kind of like do take the first couple steps, and we say it's too hard, and we throw in the towel. And I want to tell you, it is hard. But don't throw in the towel, because God is with you. And if God is with you, that work is going to bear fruit that it wouldn't bear otherwise. But we need to be prepared to do the work. And you see elements of this throughout this chapter. So let me show you this. This is verse 13. The valley gate was repaired by Hanun and the residents of Zanoah. They rebuilt it and put its doors with their bolts and bars in place. They also repaired 1,000 cubits of the wall as far as the dung gate. This passage is interesting because it's the only verse in that whole section that you're going to see like this group of people that were doing this work, and then they did a little bit more work. So, it's like the valley gate was repaired by Hanun and the residents of Zanoah. They rebuilt it and put its doors with their bolts and bars in place. Usually, that's what every other section looks like. They did this part, and this is what they did. But then, this verse includes that line, right? It says, they also repaired 1,000 cubits of the wall as far as the dung gate. So, what it's saying is like, they finished their assigned work. And for whatever reason, maybe the other person wasn't there, or maybe they were short people, they said, we're going to continue working beyond what was asked of us. Part of what it means to do hard work in rebuilding is going above and beyond. And that's just the nature of the work. I don't know if you've ever tried to start a business or a company or any sort of like new enterprise. Of like, if you are a teacher and you're like on your first couple weeks of work, you realize you're working way harder than you normally would. Why? Because a lot of times starting something takes going above and beyond. That's a type of work that requires. And listen, as a church, sometimes that's what it's going to take. It's going to take doing a little bit more than we're used to, on a little bit more than maybe what we would prefer, just because that's what needed at the time. And the hope is that it won't always be like that, right? But there are moments when something is starting that it takes going above and beyond for your own personal life. You have this plan and this idea of what this new project is going to look like, what the school year is going to look like, what working from home is going to look like, what, the new neighborhood is going to look like. And you realize, oh, this is going to take work. And it's only going to take work. It's going to take more work than I anticipated. It's going to take going above and beyond. That's just part of the nature of the work. The next thing is this. On verse 14, the next verse, it says, the dung gate was repaired by Malchijah, son of Rechab, ruler of the district of Beth Hakerem. He rebuilt it and put its doors with their bolts and bars in place. This line I didn't come up with myself. I heard John Mark Comer preach this years ago. He said, somebody's got to rebuild the dung gate. Now, if you're wondering what the dung gate is, well, you're not wondering. You figure what that is, right? Like there was a place, a part of the walls of the city where the sewage would come out. That was the dung gate, okay? This was, and guess what? The sewage was still coming out when they were building the gate. It's not like they were waiting for it. It was like all clean. Like it was functioning. There just wasn't a gate for that section. And what that means, that probably was the least pleasant job to do in the whole rebuilding project, and somebody had to do it. And the lesson here is like, when we say that rebuilding takes work, it's not only that it takes, going above and beyond what we're expecting, it also takes doing what nobody else wants to do. The work that sometimes is unpleasant or tedious, or the work that doesn't get that much praise, right? Like there's work but it needs to be done for things to happen. And part of what I'm saying is like, we have this vision for when to go. And that vision might look different. So for example, like in the case of Nehemiah, he has this vision of this rebuilt city with these walls around it, and it just looks beautiful and it's protected and people, feel happy. But for that to happen, the dung gate needs to be rebuilt. And you're not always going to be rebuilding the dung gate, but it needs to happen for the whole vision to come together. Rebuilding at the beginning is going to take going above and beyond, and it's going to take doing unpleasant work, or work that we don't want to do, or work that seems tedious or difficult for whatever reason. And that's just part of the calling of God at the time. And for many of us, some of us get to do different types of work. And some of the work that's done in churches a lot of times, it doesn't get appreciated. And I'm sorry for that. And I want to do a better job of appreciating and highlighting the work that maybe goes behind the scenes. We have people, one of my favorite things is when we're used to meet together, we had some of the people from the hospitality team, they would come in early and they would do things that nobody would see. They would follow the programs, so put pens in them and put them on the tables. And somebody would come and prepare coffee and clean the big coffee containers. And after everybody left, there were a few people that were staying behind and making sure that everything was taken apart. And that's work that matters. It might not be the most glamorous work. It might not be the work that gets highlights, but it's work that matters. It's important. And guess what? In your own life, there are things that you're going to have to do. You might not want to do. It might not be pleasant to do. Somebody has to do it. And if God is giving you this call, giving us this call to rebuild, then God is inviting us to do that work. The rest of the chapter is more of the same. It's like this group of people did this thing, and this group of people did this thing, and this group of people did this thing. And, I remember just reading it when I was preparing for this, and having this kind of this image in my mind of imagine if you're have a camera that's doing a panda vision, and it's focusing on each group of people doing the work, and then imagine it's almost like one of those drones that give you an aerial vision, and it's a drone pulling away, and you're seeing just thousands of people spread out over all these miles doing the work together. And all of a sudden you get this bigger picture of what's going on. It's not just one section of the wall. It's not just one gate. It's a whole wall surrounding the city. And it's this beautiful picture of how things come together. When we come around a vision, and it's a vision that God has given us, and when we all do our part and we all serve, when you pull away a little bit, it paints this beautiful picture of what the world should look like, of what the rebuilding of the world, what the redemption of the world looks like. It's the people of God serving the world in all these different aspects, and God, through them, bringing healing and restoration and freedom and life. And that's something far beyond what any one individual can accomplish. That only happens when we come together around a vision that God gives us. And as I asked you earlier, what if that is also true of our own personal lives? What if the rebuilding projects that we're devoting our lives to would line up with this vision that God is doing something in the world? That through Jesus, as we've been reading the past few months, that God is reconciling the world to himself. In all aspects of society, in all aspects of life. And your life has a place to play in that. And maybe this time of suffering and pain and anxiety that we've gone through these past few months can serve as this reset button that awakens us all to the role that God is calling us to play in the redemption of the world that God is accomplishing through his Son, Jesus Christ, and through his body, which is the church. But that only happens when God is at the center of our rebuilding plans. The psalmist used to say, unless the Lord builds a house, the builders labor in vain. The project of rebuilding of that wall mattered because it was God guiding it. And I only want to dedicate my life and pledge my life and devote my strength and my energies to a work that God is in. Not only as a church, but as a family, as a husband and a father. I want to devote my life, I want our family to devote our lives and our time to a work in which God is involved. That's worth building around. Jesus, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, which is kind of his biggest section of teachings, he gives all these different instruction, which is really a vision of what it looks to live a life committed to Jesus. A life of forgiveness and a life of compassion and a life of love and service and humility. And he ends that section with this in Matthew chapter 7, verse 24. He says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, Streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. Maybe this time is an invitation for us as a church and for us individually to start rebuilding, but start rebuilding around the right foundation with the right vision. And that's God. That's Jesus. That's the teachings and the life and the mission of Jesus for the world. And that's worth rebuilding around. That's worth building our church around. That's worth building our lives around. Grace.